Amanda Reiman. She of DPA fame has extensive research in her background. She did some research for the state. She did some research for Berkeley Patients Group. She's been doing research for all of us, and she takes us through her background and what she's up to now. Wonderful conversation. Enjoy. We have the Amanda Reiman here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, very much appreciate your time. And, it's all about the DPA. And you said you're also teaching some summer school at Berkeley, and you also teach some courses at Berkeley. And is there anything else that we should know about that you're working on now, other than the above?
Well, I volunteer at the Cat Cafe in Oakland.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's the other part of my life is my animal rights work.
Okay, good. All right, so a little LGBT, a little animal rights, and then, of course, there's
marijuana. They all go together. I mean, honestly. all people really want to do is hang out with their gay friends and some cats and smoke weed, so...
What could be better?
I know.
So, but for me, and I have to admit this to you, I'm not a cat person. It doesn't.
Well, this interview's over. I'm sorry.
Okay, exactly. Well, it's physical. I am allergic.
Yeah, that's what they all say.
It's true, though. I start to sneeze.
That really means I'm afraid of cats.
Well, the sneezing. What's with the sneezing then?
That's a fear reaction.
It's fear. Fair enough. I'm absolutely willing to admit that I am fearful of cats.
Okay, well, as long as we have that settled.
Yes, good, and we can move on.
Yes.
All right, great. So, where did it all start? You are, as we just learned, based in Oakland, Berkeley's, right in that fine line, Alice Waters territory.
Yes,
right?
Alice Waters territory for sure. Well, it really started for me when I was a graduate student of social work in Chicago.
Okay.
So I'm originally from the Midwest.
Oh, you are?
I am. I grew up in a fairly small town in Indiana called Carmel, Indiana. It's about 20 minutes north of Indianapolis.
Huh.
We always said that we were not Carmel by the sea, we were Carmel by the cows, which was totally true. So I didn't really have a lot of exposure, not only to drugs growing up, but to really social justice issues, right?
Yeah.
Like that wasn't really a big thing because we were all white, and it was a very homogeneous population. People had the money they needed. Yeah. They were all Republican. Yeah. I mean, it just wasn't the kind of like a hotbed of social issue.
Right.
And then in 2002, in 2000, I started grad school in Chicago in social work. And I started studying drug policy. And it was primarily because in 1998, Students for Sensible Drug Policy had their first national conference at George Washington University.
Right.
And I was interested in this issue because I was taking a class where we learned about the amendment to the Higher Education Act that happened in 1998 that said that you could no longer get federal funding for college if you had a drug conviction. Mm-hmm. And given that I was in social work school at the time, I was really struck by how that would impact potential clients of mine. People that were trying to get their lives together, people who had criminal justice involvement and were trying to get education, and how this would negatively impact them. Mm-hmm. So when SSDP formed and said, hey, we're going to have this conference, I was like, well, this is a great opportunity to learn more. So I went to DC. And it was the first time that I had been in a room with a bunch of other people that thought about social justice and drugs. And it was a really empowering experience. And it's funny because now when you look around at people like Troy Dayton at ArcView and Chris Crane at Forefront,
right.
Like we all were from SSDP. Like
right.
This is where we all cut our teeth, right, in this movement. And so, that really, it really empowered me that maybe I could actually go and make a difference. So I went back to Chicago with this idea that I was going to get my master's in social work and that I was going to do counseling with people that were on drugs, that needed help, because, this was kind of a way to empower them and to really work with this population. But as I started studying more about the drug policies, I realized that until we change the policies, like sitting in a room with someone for an hour and talking to them about their issues is a drop in the bucket if they're going to go back out into an environment where everything's stacked against them. Mm-hmm. So I decided that I really needed to change the policies. Like it wasn't just going to be about helping the people. It was going to be at actually changing the landscape. Well, I was very aware that being a woman, it was going to be difficult to do this. Mm-hmm. Women in academia, women in science, women in policy, were not often taken seriously. And so, I don't know if this was the right answer, but I said, you know what, if I get a PhD, they'll have to listen to me. Like that will be like
Dr.
you
Reiman.
are exactly. You are the expert. You know,
Right.
it doesn't matter. You know, everything else doesn't matter. So I applied to Berkeley. Because they were a very progressive school in this area. There was a professor there that I really wanted to work with, Lorraine Medanic, who was in the School of Social Welfare, and she was just like this internationally known researcher in alcohol and drugs. And I got in, and I was kind of shocked. And so I went to Berkeley. In 2002, I moved to Oakland. And I was coming from Chicago. I mean, we knew there was medical marijuana, like we saw it on the news. But we didn't really know what was going on in Oakland, California in 2002. And I was just in awe. I mean, there were these little cafes. I mean, Oaksterdam was a neighborhood. It wasn't a university.
Right.
And it was a neighborhood that had previously been extremely shut down. There wasn't a lot of commerce. There wasn't a lot of foot traffic. There weren't any restaurants. You know, folks didn't hang out there. And it was right in downtown Oakland. And it really started to turn the city around. And I saw that. I joined up with SSDP at UC Berkeley. And I became a medical marijuana patient, like a lot of people do when they move to California when they are cannabis consumers.
Right.
You know, I had legitimate health issues that I'd been using cannabis for. I had digestive issues. I have arthritis. But I had never had it sanctioned before. So I went and became a medical cannabis patient. And then I started going to dispensaries. And this was what really set it off for me. I mean, I think this is what really set me on the path that I ended up following, was that I would go to dispensaries. And back in the early 2000s in San Francisco, dispensaries are pretty much like a cross between a rec center, a summer camp, and a bar. Right? And so people
Traditional rec center.
A traditional rec center,
yes.
right? Like where people would go and they would hang out and they would do art projects and they would play bingo and they would have coffee and they would read books and they would share food. And it was something so much more than the cannabis. And I felt that that was not being represented in the media. I felt that the media kept showing this like old, withered, gray bearded person with a joint hanging out of their mouth. And it was so not what was actually going on that I felt that if we were ever going to really change the public's perception about marijuana, we had to tell them the truth about it. Like we had to show them what was really happening because the media was not doing a good job. So, long story short, I decided to do my doctoral dissertation on how medical cannabis dispensaries operated as health service providers in an effort to expose all this other stuff that was happening besides the marijuana.
Take a look inside, folks.
Exactly.
Right.
So I spent a whole summer sitting inside dispensaries collecting data from patients. And it was 2005.
Yeah.
And at the end of it all, I had 130 patient surveys. And just to give you an idea about how far we've come, this is 2005, so 10 years ago, 130 was the largest sample of medical cannabis patients in existence. 130. That's all we knew. We knew about medical cannabis patients from a collection of answers of 130 people.
Yeah.
And so I was like, it was the beginning. It was like the ground floor of something that was just going to build and build and build. And so that's...
Can I stop you there and ask you, what were you asking? What was on those surveys?
So the survey was fairly long. I had to give it to the patients. It was about 20 pages. And
20 pages?
20 pages. And a lot of folks couldn't read or couldn't see, so I would administer it to them orally. So the survey, a lot of it came from Dr. Frank Lucido, who was is my cannabis physician. He's a family practice doctor in Berkeley. He's extremely well known in the cannabis community as a physician. He's not one of these, 2-second evaluation by Skype kind of guys, right? He's an actual doctor's office guy where you go and you get your blood pressure and you get your reflexes and you get all the stuff, physically done.
A GP.
Exactly, a general practitioner, exactly. And so he also administers a survey every year. When you go to get your renewal, you have to fill out this extensive survey that asks you not only your demographic information, but it asks you about your cannabis use, how much you're using, if you're using more or less than you were a year ago. It asks you if you're using cannabis as a substitute for anything else like alcohol, illicit drugs, or prescription drugs. It's asking you who you've seen medically in that last year with your condition, who you've ever seen pertaining to your condition, just really extensive. And so a lot of what I took for my survey came from his survey, especially the substitution questions.
Yeah.
And, after I did my survey, which had demographic information, cannabis use information, it had questions about why people were using cannabis instead of something else. Like if you're using cannabis instead of a prescription drug, why?
Yeah.
And then it also included some standardized assessments of physical functioning and of satisfaction with the cannabis system. Because what we found is that people on average were statistically more satisfied with their cannabis service than the average American is with the healthcare system in America.
Right.
And so we were showing that this model, this kind of social model, comes with a very high level of satisfaction, and it also comes with a very high level of service provision. So things like social support services like legal counsel, peer counseling, things like I said, bingo and recreation, access to free food, access to clean needles or other types of healthcare and harm reduction services. A lot of these folks in early dispensaries, and it was adult daycare for a lot of these places, right? These were folks that didn't necessarily have somewhere else to be. And so they would come to dispensaries and they would spend the day there and they would, make a painting and work in the garden and help out. And what they were getting from that was so above and beyond just a high from cannabis that I worry we're losing that. And right now in California, WHAM, which is the oldest collective in the country. It was really the first model of medical cannabis distribution. And it was patients who were very ill getting together in Santa Cruz and growing cannabis for themselves. They're in danger of losing their land right now. And I feel that everybody in the industry should give them $1,000 to keep it open because this is our history. And if we don't keep our history alive, we're not going to survive. I mean, it's just that simple. So I come at this from the perspective of trying to preserve what I saw 10 years ago in those dispensaries.
So you've got really an unbelievable background in understanding exactly what it was like on the ground floor with the patients, in their minds and their bodies. You could see them, practicing being holistically kind of, we don't want to say cured, right? But at least treated. Exactly. So understanding that background, going all the way back to Indiana, I want to kind of go through your education and your background. You mentioned that you grew up in a very conservative place, and everybody kind of looked the same in their whiteness. So, how does someone like that come to be someone like this? Meaning, let's talk about the kind of eye-opening experiences along the way. What were your mom and dad like?
Well, my parents were great. I mean, I grew up in Indiana, but I was born in New Jersey.
Oh, you were? Oh, so that's why
I only lived there for 2 years. Fair
enough.
And then I escaped. So I really don't have much of that still on me in terms of an imprint. But we went from New Jersey to Detroit, and then to Chicago, and then to Indianapolis, and then back to Chicago. So I did move around quite a bit. I was a phone company brat. My dad worked for the Bell companies. So we moved around the Midwest a lot.
Ma Bell.
Exactly. And my parents are very liberal, but they're not preachy about it. I think that I was more by leading by example. They were always very much non-judgmental of different types of people. And I think that I just really picked up on that. But to be honest, I ask myself that question a lot. I really do, because, I live in Oakland, California. I've lived there for 13 years. I live in West Oakland. I'm a racial minority where I live, and that feels more comfortable to me than being the majority. And I don't know why that is. I really have no clue.
Well, what was dinner conversation like? When
we weren't a dinner by the table kind of family, right? We were very busy. Like my brother, I have one brother, and he and I were always involved in a lot of activities.
Like what?
Oh, I was a drama kid. I did speech team. I was a cheerleader. I was on the tennis team. I was into sports. And I think, one of the first things I remember is seeing how my gay friends were treated in Indiana.
But you, and I think you're maybe a little bit younger than me. What year was this when you were?
I was in high school. Yeah. I graduated in 94.
Okay. So it's actually the other way around, but whatever. Or no, I was right. You're 1 year younger than me. But kids were not, I grew up in New York. Kids, we were not allowed to be gay.
Well, there's a difference between silence and hostility. And
Speak about that,
and it was
please.
a very hostile place
Yeah.
for people that were different where I was from. And I can, I have memories of, I was on the radio, so we had a radio station, an FM radio station at my high school, and I was a DJ and did sportscasting. And so we had to take a class associated with that, and I was the only woman in the class. And I have a distinct memory, I would say I played tennis, and I have a distinct memory of the teacher and the other boys in the class starting to make fun of a friend of mine who was not in the class, who was a boy who was gay. And he's probably one of the only out gay people in my high school, which took a lot of bravery.
So he was out at that time.
So he was out at that time,
Okay.
and they were making fun of him. He wasn't even in the room. And I stood up for him because I thought it was really ridiculous that the teacher would allow, this to go on, in any case. And I remember the teacher saying, "Why are you standing up for him, Amanda?" "Well, you are on the women's tennis team."
What does that
Making some
mean?
insinuation that I was gay because I played tennis and because I didn't think it was right to talk bad about somebody when they weren't even in the room. But that kind of gives you this idea of kind of like this hostility.
Totally.
And so I think, I really had a lot of good friends in high school, and a lot of these folks are wonderful people, and we're still friends on Facebook, and they don't feel the way that they were kind of portrayed to feel in high school, a lot of them.
Sure.
And they've moved to places like Portland and California and all of that. But when we were in high school, there was a big pressure to be a certain way. And trying to give you an idea, the two biggest groups on campus were the Just Say No Club and the Fellowship for Christian Athletes.
Okay.
Now, being a Jewish cannabis consumer, I didn't really feel like I fit in for some reason.
For some reason.
But that really just gives you an idea of kind of what everyone did,
Yeah.
right? Everyone went to church and everybody played sports. Yeah. And if you didn't do one of those things or didn't do it in that way, you just weren't really made to feel like you were a part of the group, right? And so after I left Indiana, well, actually, so something did happen my senior year that also made a big difference. So my senior year of high school, in March, one of my very, very good friends was murdered. And it shook the town to its core because there wasn't even break-ins. I mean, there was no crime in this town. People left their doors open. Yeah. They let kids ride their bikes alone at night. It just, it was not that type of community. And what happened, and this was just a few miles from where I lived, what happened was that he was there with his 14-year-old sister and their babysitter, who was in his 20s. His father was out of town.
Yeah.
And he was a 17-year-old kid, and he wanted to buy some pot. And the babysitter said, "I know some folks who can hook you up." And so he called these guys to come over, and they met my friend, and they said, "Oh yeah, we can hook you up. We'll come back later on with what you want." Kind of noticing that they had a nice house and nice cars. So the guy came back later with two other guys, and I think they were going to rob them. Something went wrong. I have read some of the court transcripts, but I haven't really gotten the complete story. But something happened when they were trying to rob them, and they tied all three of them up and ended up killing all three of them.
It sounds like the town that you describe and what happened, it's in cold blood.
Yeah,
it was crazy.
Just to add to it, right? One of the guys who did it, kind of the lead guy, was the son of the leader of the Black Panthers in that area, in Indiana.
Wow.
And so immediately.
Oh, then that's that. Right.
Exactly.
Of course.
Immediately, this became about race. This became about, victimization of, affluent people at the hands of dark people. What I saw was this is an example of somebody dying because marijuana is illegal.
Right.
That was the first thing I thought of. And even though at the time, I wasn't a big cannabis consumer, I had used marijuana once or twice at a party, it wasn't a big part of my life. But where everybody else was saying, "Oh my gosh, look at this evil person who killed this wonderful guy," who I was also thinking, I was thinking, nobody gets killed because someone tries to buy them alcohol at the grocery when they're under 21. That doesn't happen.
That's where it breaks from the Truman Capote storyline for you.
Exactly. And so I was really angry because I felt that if marijuana was legal, then his friend, his babysitter, who was 22, 23, would have been able to just go buy it for him.
Yep.
And we don't want 17-year-olds using a bunch of pot, but we want them to be alive. So I think that combined with leaving Indiana and feeling like they just didn't get it, I was just kind of like frustrated. And I think I moved to Austin, Texas
That'll
after that.
help.
Okay, so this was, so this is kind of a whole other part of the story. So after high school, I went to UT Austin.
Okay.
Mostly because...
Hook 'em horns, I guess?
Yeah, hook 'em horns. Mostly because it was warm, and
Uh-huh.
I'd never lived in a warm weather climate before. And because nobody else from my high school was going there. And so I went to UT Austin, and I was going to be a sports broadcaster. That was going to be my career.
Oh, wow.
I was going to go to journalism school. Like, I really wanted to do that. And then when I moved to Austin, I met this group of people that were unlike any group of people I had ever met before. They didn't go to class. They had stressful home lives and not unsupportive families a lot of times. They used a lot of drugs.
Okay.
I had never met people like this ever in my whole life.
Fellow students.
Not really. I mean, some of them were enrolled in UT but never really went. Some of them were enrolled in local community college. Some of them were not enrolled in school at all.
How did you find these people, Amanda Reiman?
I met them through some friends in my dorm. So the first year, like, we stayed in this dorm, and like I met some folks who were local to Austin who had kind of grown up there, and so they, and then it's like, oh, you want to come smoke a joint in our room, and then it's like, oh, here's my friend who lives off campus. They're gonna have a party at their house,
Right.
so I was meeting people who had felony convictions, like a guy who had just gotten out of prison like the day before, who ended up becoming like my best friend.
Yeah.
Folks who were using injection drugs, just stuff that I had never experienced. And, I personally am a control freak. So my own experimentation was limited based on that.
I see.
I always used marijuana, obviously alcohol, psychedelics, mushrooms, LSD, ecstasy, because back in the 90s, you could actually get really good ecstasy in Texas, and it was like real. But that was pretty much it. Like, I other than that, I saw what drugs did to a lot of folks when they really compulsively used them.
Yep.
And it wasn't pretty.
No.
But I didn't blame the drugs. I blamed the system, because these folks were bright, intelligent people who, because of life circumstances, got caught up in the criminal justice system before they were old enough to really understand what that meant, and were entered into a revolving door of failed probation, back to jail, can't get a job, trying to sell drugs, failed probation. I mean, it was over and over and over again. None of them were getting help. And they would just go around and around in a circle until eventually they either ended up in prison for a really long time or died. And very few of them actually recovered and went on to do anything. In fact, the people that recovered and went on to do things were the women, which is really interesting. Most of the men died. So,
Well, I say it almost every time. That's right. The women are smarter,
well, we're smart. I mean, I think it's intelligence partially, but I also think it's survival instinct, maybe. I don't know. But my friends from Texas who are women are all now living great lives with jobs, and a lot of the men didn't make it.
Right.
So I think men also use drugs more compulsively and hazardously,
Sure.
which probably leads to that as well. So that, I think so starting in Indiana and then kind of continuing in Texas, I was really getting a great education about the harms of the war on drugs. And, I kind of liken my 2 years in Texas as kind of living amongst like a pygmy tribe or something, right? Where you kind of like learn the customs and you learn how to speak the language and you kind of build up a certain level of respect amongst the tribe, but you never really belong there. And you're not going to be with them forever. It's just that your time is there for sure. So 2 years after being enrolled in Texas, but not actually going to classes, don't do that. If you're gonna not go to class, just drop
Don't
out.
enroll.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I was 18. What did I know?
Right.
So after 2 years of doing this, I got a letter from Texas. My parents got a letter saying Amanda can't come back. She's not going to class. And so they said, all right, you're moving home. Like, you're coming back to Chicago. Like, you're not just going to sit in Texas and do nothing. And this is the part where, like, I had a family that was going to say that, and that was going to give me a place to land, and that was going to still take me back and believe in me. And a lot of people I knew didn't have that.
Right.
So I was very lucky in that regard.
Support system.
Exactly, a support system. So I came back to Chicago. I enrolled in community college because my GPA was like 0.00003 or something like that. And I went to community college. And when I went back to school, I knew I wanted to study drugs. Like, I was done with the journalism stuff, and I was like, I want to study drug use. I was very interested, and I still am, in how certain behaviors become defined as deviant. Like,
how do you mean?
So drugs weren't always illegal in the United States, right?
We've heard.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was a time when doctors could prescribe you morphine simply because you were addicted to it. But something changed. And I'm very curious about what happens to precipitate change like that. I mean, prostitution used to be legal too.
Sure.
And what happened? There's a great book called The Legislation of Morality by an amazing sociologist named Troy Duster, where he goes into just this. I mean, that book really changed my life because it made me realize that if there was a time when certain behaviors weren't viewed as deviant and now they are, we can go back. Mm-hmm. That just because marijuana use was viewed as deviant in 2005 doesn't mean it always will be, because there was a time when it wasn't. Mm-hmm. And one of the slides I always put up when I'm giving a talk, even though I'm not having any slides today, but.
And we are at the NCIA, event, and we are at the Denver Convention Center, which is why you might hear some noise in the background. But anyway, you don't have slides today.
No, I don't. I'm not having any slides today, but I do put up this slide where I show a timeline of cannabis, mm-hmm. and I show that from 3000 BC, till 1937, cannabis was a medicine.
Yes.
Nothing else. Right. It wasn't like, ooh, you're on cannabis. Like none of that. None of like, ooh, you're a stoner slacker. Like none of that. 3000 BC to 1937. That's a really long time.
Yeah, it's over 4,000 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
1937 to 1996 is when cannabis was viewed as an evil recreational illicit substance.
Mm-hmm. So 59 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then in 1996, we had California's first medical marijuana law, kind of bringing it back. So when you look at it, I mean, this is such a small freaking blip in time. I mean, this is like a hiccup in the fabric of history when we lost our way with cannabis. So I want people to understand that it's not like we're trying to take something that's always been evil and convince you it's not. We're trying to take something that's really only been evil for a second and try to remind you what it was like before that second.
That's fine. You punched the microphone. That's how excited you were.
Well, I'm punching opposition right now.
Yeah, there you go.
So I think that's really important for people to remember. So that's always really fascinated me. Is like, because I believe the same thing with sex work. I think sex work should also be legal. Anytime you prohibit something, you inherently make it more dangerous.
Absolutely.
And so
you're at the community college and you are studying a passion. You have a purpose.
And then I got straight A's forever.
Right.
As soon as I knew what I was supposed to do, everything was super easy. And I went to community college for a year. I got my GPA back up to where I could get into a 4-year school. I enrolled in University of Illinois Chicago to study psychology. And that's an undergrad.
So you are one of the many Illini.
Well, we're the Flames.
Oh, excuse me.
We're a whole different thing.
Oh, okay.
Just like the UCLA and Berkeley are two different things.
Oh, they get a different
We're also
mascot.
two different things.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
So we're the Flames.
I see.
Yeah.
We're
not a sports powerhouse.
No. But you get into and did you go for 4 years?
Well, I went for however many I had left. Right. Yeah, it took me like 6 years total to do undergrad. And so I went and studied psychology because I wanted to be a counselor, like I was saying before. Like my whole idea was like, I'm going to go, like all my friends in Texas, like if they had just had a good drug counselor, if they had just had someone that could really understand and not demonize their use, but try to understand it, they could have gotten better. Mm-hmm. And so so I went into psychology. And then when I decided to get my master's degree in social work so I could go be a therapist, this is when that whole, just to bring it full circle, this is when that whole policy change started happening. Mm-hmm. SSDP was forming, and I realized that I really needed to do something larger. Like if I really wanted to change policy, if I really wanted to make a difference in the lives of people on a grand scale. And that's what I wanted to do. I mean, that's all I've ever wanted to do is try to help as many people as possible at one time. So it's like if we legalize marijuana, when we legalize marijuana in California, we're going to be helping a whole lot of people at one time. And it's just such an efficient way to make change.
Absolutely. All right, so you graduate as a Flame. You get you immediately get your master's?
Yeah, I went straight into the master's program, did that for 2 years.
Okay.
And then I came to Berkeley.
And then you came to Berkeley again directly, getting your doctorate. Okay.
Did that in 4.
Okay, and
4
did
years.
that in 4.
So that was just like,
So it was like, okay, so we found it, and then,
right, and then I was just like, all right, I'm ready.
Okay, and you described the work that you were doing at the dispensaries. What happened with that? Did you call it your thesis?
My dissertation.
Your dissertation. What happened with that dissertation?
So it's been published as a book. It's also been, pieces of it have been published in 3 different journals. I was doing it, I had a predoctoral fellowship with the National Institute of Health.
Okay.
That's where I completed the study through the Alcohol Research Group, which is at UC Berkeley School of Public Health. It's funded by the federal government's National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. There was no cannabis research center
at all.
Right. There still isn't. So, I mean, this was really the only place I could go where there was the opportunity to do cannabis-related public health research. So I completed my predoctoral fellowship there, and then I did a postdoctoral fellowship.
Where?
Same place, Alcohol Research Group.
Okay.
And so when I was doing my postdoctoral fellowship, I was designing a study where I wanted to look at this issue of substitution. And one of the things that came out of my first research study was that about half of the folks that we surveyed said that they were using cannabis as a substitute for alcohol. And about 25% said they were using it as a substitute for an illicit substance. And about 3/4 said they were using it as a substitute for prescription drugs.
Right.
And Todd McArea, who's a psychiatrist in San Francisco, he really spearheaded this idea of substitution in the 1970s, where he was like, he would give patients who were alcoholics cannabis and then see if their symptoms got better. And they did.
Oh, wow, look at that.
Yeah, look at that. And so I was really interested in this, especially given the rising rates of prescription drug abuse and overdose death. I thought that, cannabis had always been labeled as a gateway drug, but perhaps it's better labeled as an exit drug. So I designed a study. I wanted to double the number of people, right, that I had with 130. Now, unfortunately, the federal government wasn't too keen on me using their postdoctoral fellowship to do marijuana research, especially not research that was going to show marijuana was a good thing. They called my director and said...
Who's they?
The federal government.
No, I know, but who did we know any more specifically?
The National Institute of Health, the people that oversee the
Fair
postdoc
enough.
program. Because I had been at a press conference talking about the results of my first research project,
right,
where I had said that, dispensaries offer things besides cannabis, and they offer all these services. And it was a press conference in San Diego, and this newspaper came out, and it said, "Cannabis is good for communities, federal researcher says," or something like that.
Oh.
And so they were not happy. They were not happy about that. And so my director, basically, who's a wonderful researcher and a fantastic woman, she said, "Amanda, you're going to have to choose. If you're going to stay and work with the feds and do this work here, you're going to have to research something that's less controversial, right? They all want to know about teen drug use and all these things. So, you can get federal grants and you can do this research, but it's going to have to kind of be what they're ready to fund. Or you can go off and do your own thing and study what you really want to study." So I chose the latter.
Bye-bye.
And I went and worked in academic administration for a couple years at Berkeley in the School of Social Welfare, just so that I could have a job and continue to kind of work on trying to get this research off the ground. And then in 2009, I believe, I went to Berkeley Patients Group, which is a dispensary in Berkeley that I was
great one.
Right, a great one. I knew all the folks there. At the time, 2 of the people that were leading the dispensary were Debbie Goldsberry and Becky DeCoyster. Becky's now in Maine. Debbie's still in the Bay Area. And I went to them and I said, "Hey, you guys, what would you think about hiring a director of research? No other dispensary has one. And you can hire me and I'll come and I will just do research. And I'll do program evaluation. I'll let you know what your patients want. I'll let you know what they like, what they don't like. And it's an opportunity to contribute to the greater literature on medical cannabis patients. You have so many patients. They're so loyal. They had been in my first study. They were one of the sites in my first study. And so they said, "Awesome, we will totally do that." So they did. And so I completed my second study when I was working for them, which was now 350 patients instead of 130.
You did better than you wanted to.
You're right, exactly.
More than doubled.
More than doubled. And we found the same answers when it came to substitution. We found that patients were substituting at about the same rates as they reported before for the same reasons. And so we really started to get some evidence that this was actually a thing, that patients were actually consciously doing that. And then that study was replicated once more in Canada with 1,000 patients. So we even have more now, And we found the same thing using the same instrument. So I think.
How did if I may stop you, where did you go to Canada and with whom, and how did you get so many patients?
Right. So one of my very good friends and longtime colleagues, Philippe Lucas, who's a researcher in Canada, and he started at the VIX, which is the Vancouver Island Compassion Society. It was one of the first dispensaries in Canada. It was on Vancouver Island. He was also a city councilman. And now he is the co-founder of Tilray, which is one of the companies that does the medical cannabis for the country of Canada.
One of the corporate producers, if you will.
Producers, absolutely. So he and I have been working in this area of substitution and exit drug for a decade. And so, he was very interested in replicating what I had done here in the U.S. up in Canada. So he actually got a grant from the government to do this at 4 different dispensary sites in Canada and looking again at the substitution question. So it was really exciting. We published a paper from that. And so I think that it's a really important phenomena to capture, but I feel like where it can be the most good is with practitioners. So what I'm really trying to do is take this information to people that are working with people who have drug use issues, so that if someone comes in and is like, well, yeah, I haven't used Vicodin for a week, but I have been smoking pot, that the counselor understands that they shouldn't be like, oh, you need to be abstinent and blah, blah, blah. Like they need to say, okay, let's talk about if that's making your life better. And if it is, then maybe we need to think about this as something viable. And so, I really see a future where treatment centers and more progressive treatment centers actually utilize cannabis as part of their treatment protocol to reduce anxiety, to help with sleep, to treat withdrawal symptoms. If you think about common withdrawal symptoms, nausea, difficulty sleeping, lack of appetite, irritability, anxiety, these are all so beneficial from cannabis. Things like delirium tremens for people that are trying to stop using alcohol. Cannabis is very helpful for seizure activity. So I think there's so much possibility there. But again, we have to change the perception that cannabis is a deviant activity. And we have to start looking at it as a benevolent activity.
Without question. So you've got your 350 patients, you've got your 1,000 patients in Canada. What happens next?
Okay, so what happens next is a troll named Melinda Haig.
So this is not a friend?
No, she's not my friend.
No.
She is a U.S. attorney who covers the Northern California area.
Okay.
And she lives in Berkeley, but for some reason is the only resident of Berkeley that thinks medical marijuana is a horrible thing.
Sure.
And so she went and shut down Berkeley Patients Group. She shut them down for being 980 feet from a school. Berkeley law says...
As opposed to 1,000.
Right. Well, Berkeley law says you only have to be 600.
Oh, wait.
But federal law says that if you are selling drugs within 1,000 feet of a school, it's an enhanced penalty. So what she did...
20 feet.
...is she sent a letter to our landlord in a building we had been in for 12 years... and said, if you do not evict these people, we are going to arrest you on enhanced charges for dealing drugs near a school. And what's the landlord going to do? If I'm a landlord, I'm not going to risk 20 years in prison for this.
Sorry, guys.
So they evicted us.
Yeah.
And so BPG, when they were looking for a new space, they cut their staff by 75%. And I was one of the ones that they cut because I was not essential, right? Doing research when you don't even have a dispensary, right? So they did end up opening up down the street. They bought a building, opened up down the street. They are now fighting her again. She served them with another letter. The city of Berkeley is suing the federal government to keep Berkeley Patients Group open. Drug Policy Alliance is representing the city in that suit. But she just won't let it go.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think she was frightened by a marijuana plant at a young child.
Yeah, fair enough. they must have moved more than 20 feet down.
They did, but now it's the complaint. See, what's happening is that federal law says that only K through 12 public schools are considered protected under this statute. She keeps changing the definition of what a protected place is. So then she added preschools, which is what got us in trouble in the last location.
Okay.
Then she adds any place that children may play, like parks or daycare centers or any. So
not a registered playground, any place that they
may
play.
It's like, oh, I saw a kid there last week.
Right.
And so in a city like Berkeley, which is very friendly to children and parks and things like that, it's very difficult to find a space that is appropriate.
Under her rules.
Under her, exactly.
Right.
And, it's not as if the neighbors complain. The preschool that we were too close to before was actually a preschool for blind children, or deaf children. Deaf children. And they wrote letters in our support. They were like, what? We don't need them to go. I mean, this idea that some like hand made of smoke is going to emerge from the dispensary and pluck a child off the sidewalk is crazy.
Especially when you described what it was like, or what it was and what it is like, or what it was like, at least inside of the dispensaries.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I bring my students on field trips there. At least I did when they were at their old location.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was really important for people to see the reality. I mean, when we don't know the reality, our imagination is so much worse than the actual reality, that sometimes all it takes is seeing it. And I really feel that that is what is propelling us forward with legalization. I recently wrote a blog about this for DPA. But before Colorado and Washington, I mean, yeah, you could talk till you were blue in the face about what marijuana legalization was going to look like. But in the absence of an actual policy change, people's imaginations run wild. Yeah. And so when you actually look at it, I mean, the reactions I always get when I bring people to a dispensary that have never been before is, that's it?
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Oh, well, it's kind of like Walgreens, but with plants.
Yeah.
So I
Boring.
think, exactly. And I think it's the same thing with marijuana legalization.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, marijuana is legal in Colorado now? Oh.
Okay.
Well, you wouldn't know it to walk around, except you might see a store with a pot leaf on it. I mean, it's so much more boring.
All right. And to get inside, by the way, you're going to need an ID.
Exactly. Well, that's a funny story. So my parents went to Aspen. And they wanted to go to a pot store. Yeah. They wouldn't let my mom in. Right. She didn't have her ID.
Didn't have ID.
They let my dad in. He was very excited. But and that's I think, again, this idea of prohibition, this fallacy that prohibition somehow protects us.
Right.
Which is the craziest thing. I mean, under marijuana prohibition, we don't get to decide anything. We don't get to decide who grows it, where they grow it, who they grow it for, how they sell it, none of that is under our control.
Who researches it?
Exactly. None of that is under our control.
Right.
Under regulation, we get to control every single piece of that. And so if I was a parent, if I was someone that was concerned about marijuana falling into the wrong hands, I would absolutely prefer regulation to prohibition.
Of course.
And so I think, it's a matter of changing public perception about that. And I think that having evidence and giving them something to look at is very helpful.
Absolutely. So we're weaving our way through here. And, you get bumped from DPG or BPG for obvious reasons.
Yep.
And then where did you land?
So just at that time, DPA had a job opening for a policy manager for California.
This is something you could probably do.
Yes. Yeah, this is something I could probably do. Right. So I had been a fan of DPA for a long time. Actually, I heard Ethan speak at Ethan Nadelman, our executive director, speak at the first SSDP conference at George Washington. I was completely blown away by him, as many people are when they see him speak. He had the credentials, right? He has a PhD, he's a JD, but he also had passion. And, finding those two things together, I found was very unique. And so I don't think he remembers this, but I waited for him after his talk, and I met him. I introduced myself. I was an undergrad at the time. And I told him, I would love to work for you someday. And then in 2012, I got my wish, and I was hired by the Drug Policy Alliance. I was California policy manager, which meant that, I kind of worked on all California-related legislation and policy. But really within the organization, I was hired to be their marijuana guru, right? I was hired because marijuana was really changing fast. And I know a lot about it. And I know a lot of the policies. I know a lot of the players, right? I mean, I've been involved in the California industry since 2002 when I first moved there. And so I think they were really hoping to use my expertise, which I was more than happy to give them because they are such an amazing organization and the platform that they provide is unlike any other. And then recently, last year, we developed a new unit within the organization called Marijuana Law and Policy that's housed within our Office of Legal Affairs. And so that is, at the beginning, it was just myself and Tamar Todd, who's our senior staff attorney, who is the woman sitting in the back room writing many of these initiatives that we are also thankful to have today.
Indeed.
And then since then, we've hired 2 additional attorneys. And so we have our office in Oakland, and we strictly do the marijuana policy reform work for the organization. So that's what I do now. I'm working with them. I also continue to teach at Berkeley. And I've started to get my feet wet, as an advisor in the industry as well, because I think I have a lot to offer. I've been in this industry for longer than most, which is like crazy to think that before the age of 40, you're like an OG.
Oh, sure.
In an industry,
Yeah, you
right?
are.
But when, it's so new, it's like a really weird opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm really excited to see where it goes. And I feel like I have a vested interest, because I've been doing it for so long, in steering it in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like I have to do that.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. There's a lot of people in this country that are still, getting handed down very long prison sentences for marijuana. And I feel that we have a responsibility, being in states that are more lenient, that are the ones leading the way, to come back for those that are still living under strict prohibition. And I will not end. I mean, my fight for legalization won't end until not one person is going to jail for marijuana, unless they are breaking their state's regulatory code in a way that's, posing harm to the public.
Indeed.
Like, selling pesticide-laden edibles that are making people sick. Like, I could support jail for that.
Absolutely. Please. Yeah, no, that's not the way we do things. That's
Exactly.
not the way that things should be done. I love how you just basically said, I will not stop. Just in case I will not stop.
It's not over.
Right. All right. So in terms of it's not over, I do want to get to kind of what you're working on now and the future, but I do want to dot the line of 2012, 2013, 2014 into this year at DPA and how things have changed, because, were you there before November of 2012, before the votes, and then how did things change?
Yeah, I started in July of 2012.
Okay.
And we do have offices in Colorado, led by the amazing Art Way, who's our director there. And so, we were very much involved in what was going on in Colorado. And then we also had a big hand in drafting Washington. So, I was fairly new to the organization at that point, but I was answering a lot of questions about what's going to happen if it legally, right. What's going to happen? Like, what do we know? And what's really interesting that I keep bringing folks back to is that we've had quasi-legal marijuana in California for 20 years.
Yeah.
Like, we know what it looks like, right? We know what it looks like to have to make one stop at, some kind of agency and then being able to go buy marijuana. Like, we've had that.
Yeah.
In most places in California, it's fairly easy to obtain marijuana. I mean, I live in Oakland. There's 4 dispensaries within 5 miles of my house.
Right.
Like, there's more dispensaries than there are Walgreens.
Right.
So we've had it. Like, we know what's going on.
Steve D'Angelo yesterday said that there are some groups that have 3 generations of growers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's really, we really have had this culture in California for quite some time. Mm-hmm. So, I think as we move forward and we look at other states, I'm really glad California did not go first. Mm-hmm. With our medical program, pretty much every talk I give, I'm asked, how do we not be like California? Yeah. But to be honest, California's medical marijuana program, it has a lot of issues, but the way it works beautifully. Mm-hmm. The restrictions aren't there. Anyone can become a patient, which I think is really important. So as we move forward, I think it's going to be similar to what we've seen with medical. It's going to be each state taking what other states have done, adapting it to what they feel is going to be right for their populations. Mm-hmm. Now, something that was kind of going to be different is with medical, we saw California start off with a fairly lax and open policy. And then when you look at things that are being drafted today, like Illinois, New York, it's a whole different ballgame.
Closed fist,
yeah, it's a whole different ballgame. But Colorado and Washington has started off with some pretty stringent regulations. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's necessarily going to become more tightly regulated the way we've seen medical go. But I think it is going to be something that each state is going to have to think about what's right for us. Mm-hmm. So, for example, California, outdoor cultivation is a huge issue.
Must happen, right?
It's a huge issue, right? And it's very important. Also in California is this idea, like you said, we have these multi-generational businesses and farms that have been around for a long time. We need to help them as seamlessly as possible transition from an illicit to licit market. And that's what I think is going to be key in California, where in some of these other states, it's almost like building something new. In California, we need to take what we have and we need to transition it into something that's more easily regulated and workable, which is very different than what other states are dealing with.
And you say you're happy that California didn't go first. And as I talk more to folks, it does sound like Prop 19 not passing is actually maybe kind of a gift in retrospect, because, for instance, and just specifically, the growers were not with,
Oh, absolutely.
and then now they are. Now everyone's kind of on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes and no. I mean, yes, we definitely did not have as much input from the farming community back with Prop 19, and that was crucial this time around. However, there's still like 10,000 felony arrests for marijuana in California every year, so we wouldn't have had those people in jail. So, I want to get it right, but again, I say this again and again. I'm at the end of this. I'm going to get this tattooed on my forehead. We're not running towards legalization. We are running away from prohibition, right? So we can talk all day about taxes and revenue and green rush and golden whatevers.
Yeah.
But the fact is that there's a lot of people still getting in a lot of trouble for pot.
Yeah.
And those are the people, we got to make sure that that's fixed before we start, patting ourselves on the back and being like, look at us and our awesome new industry.
Yeah, we're done. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So it's time to get to final questions.
All right.
But before I do, I want to make sure that I haven't missed anything, right? So you've got this extensive research that you've done. You have been working with DPA. You are now professing at Berkeley. And we understand what your goals and intentions are. Did we miss anything along the way, though?
I don't think so, man. I mean, I kind of spilled everything. I think, it's interesting. I'm going to be profiled in Skunk Magazine in August as their token female. And a lot of this stuff is in that article as well.
Okay.
So this is really one of the first times that I really talk about like stuff before 2002, basically. Like a lot of when people say, so tell me, your history. I usually start with when I moved to Oakland.
Right. Yeah.
And so, talking about, growing up in high school and college in Austin, I think it's a really important part of the story.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad to have an opportunity to share it.
Oh, good. And that's exactly why we do it, because who you are informs what you do.
Absolutely.
And especially in this industry, right?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So the two final questions always are, what has most surprised you in cannabis and what has most surprised you in life? And I'm going to try to, it's been a lot of cannabis for you in terms of, your work, but I want you to try to separate those things if you can. So first off, what has most surprised you in cannabis?
What has most surprised me in cannabis is that children were the group that was really going to bring down the last wall to public acceptance of medical marijuana.
How do you mean?
Well, the whole childhood epilepsy, Dravet syndrome, CBD. I mean, we have like 13 southern states that have CBD-only laws. And that is because of these parents and these kids. And, when marijuana forever was think of the children and just say no. And then this idea that that's going to be the group that's going to really do it, that's really going to soften even the hardest hearts around marijuana, I wouldn't have believed it. And obviously I want these children to have access to THC, not just CBD. It's very important. There are conditions like childhood cancer and autism where THC is crucial. But just the idea that was that population, I think, is one of the most surprising things.
It is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. And to conclude, what has most surprised you in life?
Well, it was interesting when we were opening, we were kind of talking about all these different aspects of the things that I do, right? The Cat Cafe and the LGBT activism, which involves me performing on a cheerleading squad, Cheer San Francisco.
Oh, currently.
Currently.
Oh, so that's not just past.
That's not just past. And then, being involved in the marijuana stuff. I mean, what's really surprised me most about life, I guess, is that you really can do all these really quirky, interesting things for your job. Like, you don't have to, or to volunteer. Like, a lot of times when you say to someone, okay, so what are you going to do for an occupation and for your volunteer work? Someone says, well, I'm going to work in an office and I'm going to stuff envelopes or go door to door and sell cookies or whatever people view as volunteering. Or I'm going to go, to work at a soup kitchen. But it's like, no, I was in Obama's inaugural parade and opened for Britney Spears. And I work and help people adopt kitties and play with kittens all day. And then I go and try to legalize marijuana. And that's a pretty, can I cuss?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
That's a pretty fucking awesome existence. And I think if I had been resigned to this idea that like work has to be boring and volunteer work has to be, I'll do it because it's volunteer work. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. I tell my students that all the time. I tell my students, find out what you just love and just do that.
do that.
Just do that. So that is what's most surprised me.
That's amazing. As the fire alarm goes off.
Can't smoke pot inside in Colorado, folks. Can't do it for reals. Like we're going to change that in California, by the way. We are going to have people. You're going to be able to consume cannabis outside of your home.
Yeah, more than a few people. The right people are working on consumption as we speak.
They are.
Amanda Reiman, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure.
All right. So there you have it, Amanda Reiman. Really appreciated talking to her about her background. Not an obvious background, but certainly, an obvious path for someone like Amanda Reiman. So we appreciated her time and insight and everything that she's doing for the industry. Much appreciated.